Hello, everybody. It is good to be with you, at least through this digital technology sphere that we're in, Facebook and on our website. My name is Chris. I'm one of the pastors here at Moody Methodist Church, and my hope for the next couple of weeks, kind of foreseeable future, as long as we're practicing our physical distancing from one another, is to come to you through video and offer a little bit of a Bible study. One of the major rhythms in our life here at the church and here at Moody Methodist is to grow deeper in our faith through digging into the scriptures with one another. Since we can't fully do that in person, I want to offer this to all of you over the next couple of weeks. And I wanted to start off today by digging into a passage that I've really come to enjoy over the past couple of weeks. And another one that I've been thinking about as we're kind of living into this new phase of life, if you will, as we're separating from one of ourselves, and this kind of interruption into our life and everyday rhythm. If you know me in our bridge service, I kind of preach on this a lot, but self-disclosure, I hate being interrupted. It's a growing edge of mine, at least, is dealing with interruptions. I'm a very planned person, and so I map out kind of what I want to accomplish in a day and week very kind of closely so I can stick to that to be disciplined. And when I deviate from that, it is very difficult for me, and I become a very grumpy person when I have to. So certainly a growing edge for me is interruption. And certainly COVID-19 is a huge interruption to all we had planned as a church. And I'm sure all of us have planned in our life. And so I want to, this morning or evening or whatever time of day you're tuning into this, wrestle with a really good passage that I think has to do with interruption. And again, on this, if you have a Bible with you, I want you to grab it for the next, 20 plus minutes that we're here together digging into this. We normally like to put words on the screen, but we're not going to do that this time. We all have Bibles. If not, you just open that other tab in your browser above, maybe right there, and you can just go to Bible Gateway or something. But we're going to be in Mark chapter 5, starting at verse 21. There's a great set of stories that comes here. One of the really cool things about the book of Mark is that Mark often likes to pair characters together, and then when Mark does something, when Mark does something like that and puts characters together, you know something important is coming, right? In chapter 8 of Mark and in chapter 10, there's these two great stories about blind men that you meet, and that's a really important comparison. Mark will compare the demoniac in the temple in the early part of the book to the demoniac in chapter 5, and there's a lot of good stuff going here. And today, in this passage, we get stories of two women that Jesus heals that I think he wants us to compare and that Mark wants us to compare. To borrow a line from Dickens, that these two women probably embody the best of times and the worst of times. They're similar in certain ways. So let's read the text. Again, Mark chapter 5, starting at verse 21. If you have it, I'll read it if you'd like to listen along and read along. It goes like this. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now, there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years, and she had endured much under many physicians and spent all that she had, but she was no better and grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhaging stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, and you will be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, and they put them all outside. And he took the child's father and mother, who were there with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. And this they were strictly overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. So again, and you probably saw it there, in a lot of ways you can see some of the similarities between these two girls. In some ways it was the best of times, and in some ways it was the worst of times. Mark is really detailed in this text, and he calls them both daughter. And maybe you notice the number 12 is important in both their stories. The woman had hemorrhaging, bleeding for 12 years, and the daughter who was healed was 12 years of age. And so there's some similarities, but in a lot of ways they are not alike. The story opens with Jairus, who we are told is a town leader, the leader of the synagogue, and is in many ways the protector of his daughter. He's concerned that his daughter is sick and dying, and he comes to Jesus the right way, right? He comes to Jesus from the front, approaches Jesus from the front, if you notice. He operates in ways that are socially correct. He comes to Jesus as a teacher, as someone who has built this reputation for the gift of healing. And he comes to him and begs him and urges him to come back home with him so that he can touch and heal his daughter and make her well. It's interesting. One of the subjects that they talk about a lot in scholarship around this is what's called the politics of touch. There's a lot of ways we could talk about this, and I won't go into a whole detail on this, but imagine with me your supervisor, right? Your boss. If you at work are maybe going through a difficult time, something kind of bad happens, and your supervisor comes to you and maybe touches you on the shoulder, right? And says, Jerry, for me, says, comes to me and says, "Chris, I'm really sorry that your pet hamster died. I know that's devastating you. It's okay. And, he maybe touches my shoulder or my back in an appropriate manner to comfort me. That is okay because he is a person of authority. Who's coming to me, one of his subordinates, he's my boss, is doing that. But if I went to Jerry and I come around and, Jerry is upset, say because of the 2017 Astros cheating in baseball or something like that, and Jerry's crying in his office, and I come over to him and I touch him on the shoulder and say, Jerry, I'm sorry about that, right? His response would be, "Get your hand off my shoulder." Well, Jerry's kind and he might appreciate that, but we can't imagine going to people who are really high up. If I went to the bishop of our conference and did that, I might not have an appointment anymore. There are certain unspoken rules that have to do with touch. So it's something we aren't used to in particular ways. And so this part of the story, Jairus comes to Jesus and says, if you could just reach out and touch my daughter, she will be made well. And so you have that kind of socially appropriate. Jairus is coming to Jesus and asking, and Jesus is this healer coming to someone who's not in this position of authority. So that's all correct. And not only this daughter, but the text kind of implies that Jairus is hiring professional mourners, right? That there are people there. She has a social support system. Some scholars, again, say that even they think these are paid mourners, that Jairus is paying people to be there mourning over his daughters. So in many ways, her situation is bad, but it embodies what Dickens would say is the best of times, that even though she is sick, she has an advocate, someone who cares for her, a father. She's got a whole network and series of support. And so we start in the story there with Jairus' daughter. And Jesus, as Jesus does, the right thing, this person of authority comes and says, I need your help. And Jesus says, yeah, okay, great. Where do we go? And so Jesus begins to journey with Jairus, but there we get an interruption into the story. And we're introduced to this other woman, who, by the way, is nameless in the story. And for 12 years, she has been struggling with bleeding or hemorrhaging, as the text translates it. She has this disorder that has, not only made life difficult for her physically and kind of medically, but in addition to that, it has made her life an outsider in regards to the social community. In biblical terms, because of this illness, she is what other people in the Bible would describe as unclean, right? Ceremonially unclean, which in our 21st century language means she cannot go to church. She can't worship at the temple, for she cannot become clean in the kinds of ritual purity ways that you would need to become clean. In all likelihood, if she was married, she is probably now divorced, because for 12 years she's been unable to bear children. And that would have been her significant contribution to the community. Not only is she isolated and broken, but Mark even tells us that she has gone to see people, right? She has looked for that support system. She's gone to see doctors. And this is kind of one of those texts we need to step back from our 21st century eyes with, because when you and I talk about seeing doctors, that's a really important thing that, we ought to be doing. If people are sick, we're saying, go see the doctor, right? If you're not well, stay home maybe and go see the doctor. Check in, use a virtual doctor. We've got all sorts of great resources for that. But back then, because doctors are somebody that we can trust, right? They get certified through boards, they take medical exams, they go through 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, 4 or 5 years of residency. So 10 plus years of their life is set training and preparing for this. Back then, in the first century, and the kind of people this nameless woman would have been seeing were the kind of peoples that come to town and say, yeah, I've got something that could fix you. Try this concoction. Try this syrup that I came up with. That'll be, $100, right? And they try it, it doesn't work, and when they go to get a refund or try something else, that person has already left and gone on to another town. And that they were people who preyed upon and exploited the vulnerabilities of the weak and of people who were in need. But in her desperation, she's gone to these doctors, only not to get better, but to get worse. And on top of that, to have all of her resources drained. And so she is really the epitome of desperation and brokenness. And if Jairus' daughters is in this sense the best of times, then this woman embodies what we would say is the worst of times. And so she thinks, kind of knowing about Jesus too, in the same way, that if I could just go up behind him, right? Jairus comes to Jesus in front of him and approaches him. She thinks inversely, not following the politics of touch, right? If I can just sneak up behind him, then touch even just his cloak, right? It's not even touch Jesus who has the source of this power, but just something kind of secondary to him. The cloak that he is wearing out over his clothes, right? This third layer of Jesus here. If I could touch even just that, maybe things will be different, right? Maybe this will do it. And so she touches his cloak, and immediately she knows that something happens, right? And I love this part of the story. It's almost humorous for us. Jesus says, "Oh, somebody touched me." And the disciples say, "Well, yeah, Jesus, are you nuts? We are just crammed in this crowd. No, duh, somebody is touching you. We are just surrounded by people." And he says, no, somebody in a different way, right? My power has gone from me. Who's touched me? And he looks around, and again, this part of the story is probably difficult for us with our 21st century eyes and ears to hear. But it's likely that she touches him and realizes that she has been healed. But her nervousness isn't necessarily that she's done something inappropriate, but many scholars fear that maybe her touching him has taken his power away. The closest thing that I could liken it to is if you remember the kind of story of Samson in children's church, who's strong and powerful as long as what, right? Maybe you remember? Yes, as long as he doesn't cut his hair. If you didn't get it, that's okay. But right, he has this power as long as he can keep his long, sort of luscious hair going. He's got all of that strength, but as soon as he cuts it, right, he loses that power. It's taken away. So there is likely that kind of fear in this story, right? That she, who is the embodiment of being impure in this culture, touches Jesus, who is the embodiment of holiness. And there is this fear that if she touches him, that she will contaminate him and rob him of that power, rob him of that holiness that he has. I think in our context, maybe you're seeing the connections, but we think about it a little bit as germs. I probably haven't thought this much about germs in a long time. We kind of go through those cycles where we are cleaning vigorously because of the flu as seasons go. And then in the summer, we kind of are a little bit more lax with that kind of stuff. And then flu season comes around and we become more diligent about washing our hands. I remember the first time I went to go visit one of our congregants who's undergoing cancer treatments. The first time I visited them, I had to wear, the mask, the really good quality mask that they have. I had to put gloves on, and then I had to put under the gloves, but over me, one of those big kind of protective suits. I don't know what it'd be called, the medical term, but those kind of medical covers. And all of those, right, were not to protect me from any germs that she had, but were because I had germs and she had a compromised immune system, right? And so like we've learned recently, you wear masks to prevent your own spread of germs to others. And so they were worried I might spread any germs that I was bringing in to her, and that they would be even more deadly because of her compromised immune system due to cancer, right? And we know whenever someone is sick, we're worried about germs, especially now. We're incredibly worried about how something like COVID-19 translates so easily. And so there's a message here that we kind of have to hold in tension, that it is difficult. And as we think about this text, we should think about the fear that she has that she might contaminate the Holy One. But inversely, we have to also swing to the other side of the pendulum too, to say, one of the things I think we learn in this text is that in some ways the mark of a good neighbor is also not being afraid of being contaminated. Part of the power of this text is not that her brokenness and her excluded, kind of her impurity, if you will. It's that Christ's holiness is never at risk, and he's never at risk of being contaminated. One of the interesting things I was reflecting on this week is a great book I read is by a guy named Rodney Stark, and he's a sociologist. and it's called The Rise of Christianity. One of the really interesting things that he talks about in that book is the way that Christianity grew as a whole. Now, maybe many of us are familiar with the Great Commission, Matthew 28, 19, and 20, right? To go out and make disciples from every nation and baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And it's this great passage we all know, and we all have the kids' songs that we sing about it. Now, Stark in that book, The Rise of Christianity, wants to ask how Christianity grew from the early days of Jesus, kind of by the 4th century, into this major religion that was spread all throughout Rome and the Western world, right? How did it go from this marginalized movement of, just a dozen people, right, to this global phenomenon in just 4 centuries? Now, our initial answer to this, that many of us would probably say, has to do with the Great Commission, right? That the disciples went out and made more disciples, and then those disciples made more disciples, and so on and so forth. But Stark makes a different argument, and he said that a different passage in the Bible and a different passage in Matthew was more critical. There was a parable in Matthew 25 about the sheep and the goats, and this may be one you remember too. And it has that great line that talks about how Christ will come in different ways and you won't recognize him. And the disciples ask, Lord, when did we see you hungry? When did we see you without clothing? And when did we see you without that? And Christ flips it to say, anyone that you see without food, anybody you see without shelter is me in need, right? And expands our hospitality. And in this book, Stark argues that it's that text, that idea of taking care of one another in times of need, is what grew the church. And in particular, in times of 2 plagues. One of them was smallpox, and the other one I am not remembering off the top of my head, and I did not write it down. So you'll have to read the book to find out. But there were these 2 really serious plagues in the early church, in the 2nd century, they think. Not too similar to kind of the pandemic we're experiencing now with COVID-19. And Christians at the time were the only group that was caring for people, right? Granted, they took precautions not to expose themselves in ways that they would contract something like smallpox. But they were caring for the families who maybe had a child or a parent who died of smallpox. They were running towards instead of away from the people who were contracting that. And because of their cleanliness and care, began to care for the people who were suffering from that. And so, long story short of the whole book, Stark argues that kind of those 2 plagues, along with Christianity's compassion for people who are suffering, and kind of like this text points out, right, that they were not afraid of people who, like this woman, were seen as compromised or contaminated, right, knowing that they were Jesus in need and beloved people of God. Right? Because of that mentality, the church began to grow. And I think in a lot of ways, as we think about this text, we're being called to physically distance ourselves from one another, and I don't want that message to get lost, because that is so critically important that is something that we do, not only for our sakes, but for the sake of one another and for the sake of the people that are most vulnerable. But that there are still ways that we can run towards one another in safe and secure ways, to, in the midst of this sort of new experience, care for one another. So I think that's the first key message that we see from this text. But I want to say one other thing, too, as I kind of wrap this up. There's this realization let me say one more thing. I forgot. I wrote this down, and I want to read it. This is the first thing I want us to get, right? Let me just read it as I wrote it. As good neighbors, being good neighbors to our neighbors, and not just our literal neighbors, but really all to our those in our community. That all those people who are like the unnamed woman and might be considered outsider or outcast or excluded or unclean, we're reminded about the immense value that they bring to the people of God, right? And there's this really powerful moment, too, in the text where Jesus calls this woman daughter. This woman who has no support system, no family, who's been pushed to the margins of society, who's brought to the center, or who is on the outskirts of society, Jesus brings her into the center of the family as Jesus' beloved daughter. So that important part, right, has to do with how we see and treat those who are on the margins. And especially in this time of distancing ourselves, that there will be so many people who are now moving out to the margins, where, like this woman, their support system may not be seen, it may not be there. They're being moved to the margins financially, physically, because they can't get out to get things like groceries safely. There are lots of needs that may arise, and I think part of this text is to say, in our time, how can we safely connect with one another and make sure everybody is at the center of this community? So that's the first important message I think this is getting at. And here's the second one, and I'll end with this. I love the way, when we go back to the story, Mark almost paints this picture as though Jesus gets distracted with this woman, right? He starts blessing to her, talking to her, calling her daughter. All this will all this is happening, another group from the Jairus' house shows up and says, well, y'all took too long, and Jairus, your daughter is dead, right? You don't have to show up anymore. She's dead. We don't have to bug Jesus anymore. And so it's fascinating in the way this narrative gets told. Mark, one of the ways he likes to tell stories, right, is by essentially sandwiching these two stories together. So the Jairus story starts, you get interrupted with the story of this unnamed woman, and then we have the resolution to Jairus' story over here, right? It's like a story sandwich is what I like to call them. And so you could imagine this too from Jairus' perspective. For 12 years, you cared for your daughter. You've done all you can to make her well. You hear about this man, Jesus from Nazareth, and wherever he's gone, there are these reports of the blind seeing and the lame dancing and the deaf hearing. And so you think, all right, maybe this guy can do something for my daughter. And so you're able to navigate the large crowds to get in there. He actually agrees to come and see your daughter. And so you say, all right, we got to hurry, right? Yeah, giddy up. Let's go. And Jesus says, okay, all right. Only to get interrupted by this woman who touched his cloak. And so I imagine to Jairus, right, is walking with someone, like Ray Pinard, if you know Ray. Ray just gets interrupted by everybody because Ray knows everybody, and he's so intentional about taking that kind of time with every person. And Jesus, in that same way, is probably doing something similar. And so I think Mark sandwiches these stories not just to compare the two women, but to remind us that these kinds of interruptions in our life, the people and things that we deem interruptions in our life, can actually end up in really holy moments, right? When we come, we're preparing to get to Easter too, right? And we're doing that because we worship a God whose death was interrupted by new life and resurrection. We just had celebrated Christmas a couple of months ago, where we realized we worship a God who has broken in and interrupted human history, right? A God who constantly is interrupting our best laid plans to invite us into new things that God is doing. I shouldn't hit this microphone. That's probably not good for the sound. And so God is constantly, in good ways, interrupting. But as we're in the midst of a crisis that has essentially interrupted just about every aspect of our life, from sports, this past weekend, I was going to be doing 3 fantasy baseball drafts for leagues that were interrupted. So I am mourning that, right? We're mourning the loss of the NBA and pretty much all sports, right? We're mourning our ability to go to things like weddings that were planned, other group-wide events, the rodeo, barbecues, small group, prayer meetings, fellowships. I mean, whatever it is, we are lamenting that it has probably been interrupted, canceled, and delayed. But in the midst of COVID-19, this mass interruption into our life, I think this passage reminds us that God is still inviting us to discover ways in which we can do ministry in the midst of interruption. And to not see this as an interruption and dwell on that as an interruption, but to begin to discover the kinds of holy moments that are created out of this. Whether it's time now Zooming one another in small group, whether it's more intentionality about calling and reaching out to one another. Whatever it is, God is inviting us to discover that. Let me end by reading this great quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his book Life Together. He says this: "We must ready to allow ourselves to be interrupted by God. God will be constantly crossing our paths and canceling our plans by sending us people with claims and petitions. We may pass them by, preoccupied with our more important tasks. It's a strange fact that Christians and even ministers," I meant to scratch that part out, but Christians and even ministers frequently consider their work so important and so urgent that they will allow nothing to disturb them. Yet they think they are doing God a service, but actually they are disdaining God's crooked yet straight path. And so my hope is this, as good neighbors, that you and I might learn like Jesus to respond and go from these interruptions in our life with joy. Amen? All right, take care, friends. Hope to see you soon.